tonight. I'll go straight into it in the interest of time. So my wife and I moved to Niger Republic in West Africa, and the landscape that confronted us was at the point of ecological collapse. It was barely able to support life on Earth. And yet in my lifetime, I was in my early 20s at that time, this had been a biodiverse dry land landscape with wildlife, patches of farmland, ponds and springs. The effect of climate change and extensive land clearing were devastating. And so they experienced increasing frequency and severity of drought, insect attack, and regular hunger. In my mind, if deforestation was one of the root causes of these problems, then the solution was relatively simple. We just needed to plant trees. However, in that harsh climate, it simply didn't work, not in an effective, sustainable manner. Most of those trees died. And again, for the sake of brevity, I'll cut this story very, very short. What we hadn't realized was actually, even in that seemingly barren landscape, there were tens of millions of trees. However, they were underground. And what I mean by that is that the original forest had been cut, and many of the stumps were still alive with the capacity to resprout. And certainly, even in the absence of stumps, there are seeds in that landscape with the ability to reshoot. And I call this the underground forest, because if we had the vision to see under the ground, we would quickly realize that when you cut a tree down, for most species, it's not the end of that tree's life. And the roots have access to moisture and nutrients and stored sugar. They can actually grow very, very quickly if we allow them to regrow. And so the whole dynamic changed. This was not a monetary problem or a technical problem needing external expertise. This was a mindset problem. And if it was people's false beliefs about trees and negative attitudes and destructive practices that had brought the environment to its knees, that's where the true battle lay. And so the technique that we came up with is called farmer-managed natural regeneration, or FMNR. And in fact, it's not new. It is a traditional practice that you can find examples of going back centuries in Europe, in Africa, around the world. But basically, it's the management of these sprouts coming up from tree stumps. Selection, thinning, pruning, protection. Over the following 20 years, adoption of FMNR spread at a rate of 250,000 hectares per year until over that 20 years, 200 million trees across 5 million hectares of farmland were returned to that landscape. And just a short diversion, in the 12-year period prior to that rediscovery of the underground forest, $160 million was spent to restore just 20,000 hectares. That's $8,000 per hectare. The cost per hectare of FMNR came out at about $2 per hectare. If we use conventional methods just to reforest the Sahel, it would cost in excess of $120 trillion. It's just not going to happen. And so landscapes like this on the left were relatively rapidly transformed into landscapes like this. Agroforestry parklands, productive lands with a scattering of trees. When I joined World Vision in 1999, I took the technique to other regions, and the same principles apply, and I'll come back to that slide. The same principles apply at the foothills of the Himalayas, to mangrove swamps, to the humid tropics, even in hyper-arid areas. Wherever there are living tree stumps or seeds in the ground, those principles can be applied. And this is a case in southern Ethiopia where a forest was restored by the community. It rehydrated the landscape, biodiversity came back, and people were able to generate wealth, not only through carbon credits, but the productivity and the resilience of the land, even in the face of a changing climate, greatly increased. We estimate that there are about 18 million hectares of land around the world with one or other form of FMNR being practiced. And I hasten to add that much of that has nothing to do with me. These are often farmer-generated movements. But why is it that farmers are doing this? And if we take the case of Niger, across that 5 million hectares, gross household income has increased by about $1,000, or across the total, $900 million every year without ongoing projects or subsidies or assistance, assisting 4.5 million people. Because of the improved microclimate under the trees, the better soil, the lower wind speeds and temperatures, Nigerian farmers every year are growing 500,000 tons of grain additional, enough to feed 2.5 million people. And wherever we've applied this process, rural communities have benefited. More fuel wood, more fodder, alternative income streams such as beekeeping, increased crop yields, increased livestock productivity. I want to throw a thought bubble out to you. The time is too short, given the accelerating pace of climate change, the continued land degradation, deforestation, and so on. Normal mathematics won't cut it anymore. 1 + 1 = 2 is too slow. And what I mean by that is, if we merely add new projects, we will never solve these problems at scale in the time remaining. We need God mathematics, where 1 + 1 = 11 or 22 or even 44. We need the type of movement that we witnessed in Niger, where through word of mouth, through teaching by example from farmer to farmer, the idea just spread. And dare I say it, post-COVID, it spread virally, even without my knowledge. And so we need this kind of phenomena, but on a global scale. And I have optimism. When we look at figures from the World Resources Institute, there are in excess of 3 billion hectares of degraded land. Approximately 51 million kilometers square of the Earth's surface is under agriculture, and there are more than 500 million farmers in the world. So just in summary, nature has enormous resilience and self-healing properties if we will work with it instead of always fighting it and hitting it on the head, working against it. I believe that farmers constitute one of the biggest untapped forces for restoration and for fighting climate change. And then finally, that last point, the need for God's mathematics. We need to think in terms of movements rather than in terms of addition of new projects. We just won't make it in time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, and that was absolutely brilliant.